It was an ordinary Wednesday evening when Derek came home early from work. The last thing he expected was to catch his wife, Mia, in the act of infidelity. As he entered the house, the sound of laughter and unfamiliar voices echoed through the living room. Confused, Derek followed the noise to find Mia tangled in the sheets with another man, a man he had never seen before. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he stood frozen, disbelief clouding his mind. Mia looked up, her face draining of color, her eyes widening in panic. The man in her arms, still half-dressed, scrambled to gather his things. Derek didn't give him the chance. His blood boiled, rage clouding his vision. The betrayal of the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had built a life with, was too much to process in the moment. "Who the hell is this?" Derek demanded, his voice a low growl as he clenched his fists. Mia stammered, her voice barely audible. "Derek, I can explain." Before she could finish, Derek turned toward the man, eyes locked onto him with a venomous stare. Without another word, he lunged forward, grabbing the man by the collar and throwing him to the ground. The stranger tried to scramble up, but Derek was too fast. His fists landed with brutal force, each punch fueled by hurt and anger. The man tried to fight back, but he was no match for Derek's rage. Every strike felt like an expression of the pain he had been hiding for months, ever since Mia's behavior had started changing. The man's attempts to shield himself were futile. Derek wasn't stopping. Mia screamed for Derek to stop, tears pouring down her face, but Derek couldn't hear her. All he could focus on was the betrayal. Finally, with the man barely conscious on the floor, Derek stood up, breathing heavily, his body shaking from the adrenaline. "Get out," he spat, his voice raw. "Both of you. I never want to see either of you again." The stranger, barely able to stand, stumbled toward the door, a bloody mess. Mia looked at Derek, pleading with her eyes, but the look of rage on his face left no room for discussion. As she stood there, broken and regretful, Derek's heart shattered. But the trust was gone. The love they had built over the years had been destroyed in an instant. As Mia left, Derek was left alone, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered marriage. The pain was almost unbearable, but one thing was clear to him. This was the end of their story. The days that followed were a blur for Derek. The adrenaline of that night slowly wore off, and what remained was an empty house filled with reminders of Mia, the woman who had once been his everything. Her scent lingered on the pillows, and her belongings still occupied the closets. He couldn't bear to touch them, yet he couldn't bring himself to get rid of them either. It felt as though he was living in a ghost town of his own life. Mia called him multiple times in the following days, leaving voicemails pleading for forgiveness. Her voice sounded broken, full of regret, but Derek couldn't bring himself to listen. Every time he heard her name, a sharp ache stabbed at his chest. The person he had trusted most in the world had betrayed him, and it was hard to imagine ever letting go of that hurt. It was a weekend when Derek finally decided to take control of his life. He didn't want to be the man left behind, drowning in self-pity. He spent the next few weeks focusing on himself, getting back to hobbies he had neglected, meeting with friends who had become distant, and even starting therapy. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his life. Then, one day, as he sat at a cafe with a friend, Derek ran into Mia. She was sitting at a table by herself, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, and her appearance was noticeably different, almost like a shadow of her former self. When she saw him, her face flushed with shame, but she didn't turn away. Derek's heart still raced as old emotions surged, but he held his ground. This time, it wasn't anger that filled him, it was a quiet sense of clarity. Mia stood up, hesitating for a moment before walking over to his table. "Derek," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I don't deserve to ask for this, but please, can we talk?" Derek looked at her, the wound still fresh but not as raw as before. He could see the pain in her eyes, but something inside him told him this conversation would be different. He nodded, motioning to the empty chair across from him. "I've been a fool," Mia began, her hands shaking. "I don't know what got into me. I thought I was unhappy, but the truth is I was just lost." I made a terrible mistake, and I can never undo it. But I need you to know that I regret everything. Every second I spent with him was a lie, and it destroyed me to see what I did to you." Derek listened, his gaze unwavering. It hurt to hear the remorse in her voice, but part of him still wasn't sure if he could ever trust her again. "Why didn't you come to me first? Why didn't you talk to me when things started falling apart?" His voice was calm, but the pain lingered in his words. Mia looked down, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought I could fix things on my own, but I was too proud to admit I was unhappy and too scared to ask for help. I thought running away from the problem would make it disappear. I was wrong." The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Derek's mind raced. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. Part of him still loved her, the woman he had shared his life with for years, but another part knew that love wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Derek said finally, his voice soft but resolute. "What you did, I can't just forget it. And I don't think I'll ever trust you the way I did before. But maybe time will help. Maybe it'll help me heal." Mia nodded, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her regret. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I just wanted you to know how sorry I am, Derek." They sat there in silence for a while, the years they had spent together flashing before Derek's eyes. He realized that even if they could never go back to what they once had, he needed to find peace within himself. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of the past. "I think it's time for both of us to move on," Derek finally said, his voice steady, but with a tinge of sadness. "We can't go back to what we were, Mia. It's over." Mia nodded once more, her tears falling freely now. "I understand. I always will, Derek. I'll never forget what you meant to me." As Mia walked away, Derek felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The finality of it all, of the years of hurt and confusion, was now clear. He still had a long journey ahead of him, but at least it was his own journey now. And for the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful again. The days that followed were quieter, less tumultuous for Derek. He focused on rebuilding his life piece by piece. He continued therapy, took up new hobbies, and spent time with friends who were there for him when he needed them most. Each day, he felt a little lighter, a little closer to the man he once was before Mia's betrayal had clouded everything. Despite this, there were moments of weakness. Late nights when the silence in the house felt deafening. Small reminders of Mia would sneak up on him. Photos tucked away in drawers, a text message draft from an old conversation, the sound of a song they once loved. He'd feel the weight of it all, but every time he did, he reminded himself that he was moving forward, that he was healing. Mia had stopped reaching out after their last conversation. Derek wasn't sure if she was giving him the space he asked for, or if she had truly accepted the reality of their situation. Either way, he hadn't heard from her in weeks, and the peace that came with that was both comforting and bittersweet. He thought of her less frequently now, but when he did, he couldn't shake the sense of sadness that lingered. She wasn't the woman he had married anymore, and he wasn't the same man he had been when they'd started their life together. One evening, Derek found himself at a bar with a few of his friends, celebrating a small victory at work. He hadn't intended on going out, but his friends had insisted, trying to lift his spirits. As they laughed and clinked glasses, Derek realized just how far he had come. He wasn't completely healed. He wasn't sure if he ever would be, but he was starting to understand that life could still be good. That even in the aftermath of betrayal, there was still room for joy. That was when he noticed her, Mia. She was sitting at the bar, alone, with her back to him. Derek's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see her again, especially not in a place like this. He didn't know if it was curiosity or something else, but he couldn't help but stare. She hadn't noticed him yet, and as he took in her appearance, he saw that she had changed. Her once bright demeanor was now subdued. Her eyes, which had once radiated confidence, seemed lost. The sight of her in this unfamiliar state made something inside him stir, a mixture of pity and anger, but also a sense of closure. He couldn't stop himself. He walked over to her, his footsteps slow but determined. As he reached her side, she turned to look at him, her expression one of surprise mixed with apprehension. "Derek," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Mia?" There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice breaking. "I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't think I'd ever see you again after everything." Her eyes were brimming with tears, but she held them back, almost as though she were afraid to break in front of him. Derek's chest tightened as he looked at her, realizing just how much time had passed since their last conversation. She looked like a stranger, but at the same time, a part of her was still the woman he had known and loved. He took a deep breath, and in a soft but firm voice, he spoke. "I'm doing okay, Mia. I'm moving on." His words hung in the air, clear and simple. "And I think you are, too. I can see it." Mia wiped her eyes, managing a weak smile. "I'm trying. It's been hard. I don't expect you to forgive me, Derek. I wanted to see you one last time. To say goodbye properly." Derek took a moment, letting her words sink in. He thought back to the pain of their final days together, the anger, the confusion, the betrayal. But now, in this moment, he realized something. Their story was over. There was nothing left between them but memories, and they no longer held the power to hurt him. "I think it's time for both of us to let go," Derek said, his voice steady but with a touch of sorrow. "There's nothing left here anymore, Mia. And maybe that's okay." Mia nodded, her face softening. "I know. I've known for a while now. I never wanted to be the one to say it." Derek took one last look at her, the woman who had once been the center of his world. The memories of their time together would always be a part of him, but they no longer defined him. He was ready to move forward, to let go of the past. "Goodbye, Mia," he said quietly, his words carrying more weight than he had intended. "I hope you find peace." She smiled faintly, her voice shaking as she replied. "Goodbye, Derek. I truly hope you find happiness." With that, Derek turned and walked away, not looking back. As he left the bar, the weight on his chest felt lighter than it had in months. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally free.